My name is Dr. Rachel Thompson, and I have been working as the head nurse at Memorial Hospital in Boston for 15 years. In that time, I have seen thousands of patients, countless visitors, and every type of human behavior imaginable. But I had never encountered anyone quite like the old man who brought flowers to room 412 every single day. I first noticed him on a Monday morning in late September. He was in his late 70s, impeccably dressed in a gray suit that looked like it had been tailored decades ago, but was still perfectly maintained. He carried a small bouquet of white roses wrapped in simple brown paper, and he walked with a slight limp that suggested an old injury rather than the weakness of age. "Excuse me, sir," I said as he walked past the nurse's station. "Can I help you find someone?" The old man smiled politely and said, "No thank you, nurse. I know where I am going. Room 412. I watched him walk down the hallway with his flowers, moving with the confident familiarity of someone who had made this journey many times before. He disappeared around the corner toward room 412, and I thought nothing more of it. But the next day, he was back. Same gray suit, same white roses, same destination. And the day after that. And the day after that. By the end of the first week, I had become curious about this dedicated visitor. Room 412 was currently occupied by Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman recovering from hip surgery. She had plenty of family visitors, but I had never seen this particular man among them. "Mrs. Henderson," I asked during my rounds, "do you know the gentleman who has been bringing flowers to your room every day? The older man in the gray suit?" Mrs. Henderson looked confused. "I have not received any flowers from a man in a gray suit, dear. My daughter brings me flowers, but no one else." This was strange. I had seen the man walking toward room 412 multiple times with flowers, but Mrs. Henderson insisted she had not received any flowers from him. The next morning, when the old man arrived with his daily bouquet of white roses, I decided to follow him at a discreet distance. I watched as he walked down the hallway, turned the corner toward room 412, and then did something that made no sense at all. He stopped in front of room 412, stood there for a moment looking at the door, placed the flowers on the floor against the wall, closed his eyes, as if saying a silent prayer, and then turned and walked away without ever entering the room. I was completely baffled. Why would someone bring flowers every day and then leave them outside the door without delivering them to the patient? After the old man left, I picked up the flowers and brought them to Mrs. Henderson. "These are from your mystery visitor," I said. Mrs. Henderson looked at the white roses with a sad expression. "How strange. These are funeral flowers." "White roses are what you bring to remember someone who has passed away, not what you bring to someone recovering in a hospital." That afternoon, I mentioned the strange visitor to Dr. James Morrison, who had been working at Memorial Hospital for over 30 years. "Dr. Morrison, have you ever noticed an elderly man in a gray suit bringing flowers to room 412? I asked. Dr. Morrison looked surprised. "Room 412? Rachel, are you sure it was room 412? "Positive. I have seen him there every day for the past week." Dr. Morrison became very quiet, and his expression grew troubled. "Rachel, I need to tell you something about room 412 that not many people at this hospital know." He led me to his office and pulled out an old file from his desk drawer. 25 years ago, room 412 was the site of one of the most tragic cases this hospital has ever handled. Dr. Morrison showed me a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1998. The headline read, "Local teacher dies in hospital after accident. Husband charged with negligent homicide. Her name was Elizabeth Bennett," Dr. Morrison explained. She was a 32-year-old elementary school teacher who was brought to this hospital after a car accident. She was in room 412 for 3 weeks before she passed away from her injuries. "What happened?" I asked. Her husband, Thomas Bennett, had been driving the car when they crashed. He had been drinking, ran a red light, and hit another vehicle. Elizabeth was critically injured, but Thomas walked away with only minor injuries. Dr. Morrison continued. Thomas was charged with negligent homicide and vehicular manslaughter. He served 5 years in prison. But the real tragedy was that Elizabeth was pregnant when she died. She was carrying their first child. I felt a chill run down my spine. Dr. Morrison, do you think the old man bringing flowers could be Thomas Bennett? I do not know, Dr. Morrison replied. Thomas was in his 50s when Elizabeth died, so he would be in his late 70s now. And he always wore gray suits to court during his trial. But Dr. Morrison, why would he come to room 412 every day? Mrs. Henderson is in that room now, not Elizabeth. Dr. Morrison looked uncomfortable. Rachel, there is something else you should know. After Elizabeth died, her family requested that room 412 be permanently closed as a memorial to her. The hospital administration agreed, and for 20 years, room 412 remained empty. But the room is being used now, I said. Mrs. Henderson has been there for 2 weeks. That is because 5 years ago, the hospital was renovated and expanded, Dr. Morrison explained. During the renovation, the new administration decided that keeping a room closed for sentimental reasons was not practical. They reopened room 412 over the objections of some of the older staff members. I was beginning to understand the situation. So Thomas Bennett might not know that room 412 is occupied again. He might think he is still bringing flowers to an empty memorial room. Dr. Morrison nodded. If that man is Thomas Bennett, he has been coming here for 25 years to remember his wife. He probably does not know that the room is being used for patients again. That evening, I decided to wait for the old man the next morning and speak with him directly. I needed to understand who he was and why he continued this daily ritual after so many years. When he arrived the next morning with his white roses, I gently approached him before he could walk away. "Excuse me, sir," I said. "I have noticed you bringing flowers here every day. May I ask who you are visiting?" The old man looked at me with sad, tired eyes. "I am visiting my wife, nurse. I have been visiting her every day for 25 years. Sir, what is your wife's name?" I asked gently. "Elizabeth," he replied. "Elizabeth Bennett. She was the most beautiful woman I ever knew, and I killed her." I stood in the hospital hallway facing Thomas Bennett, the man who had been bringing flowers to room 412 for a quarter of a century. Up close, I could see the deep lines of grief and regret etched into his face. "Mr. Bennett," I said gently, "I am Rachel, the head nurse on this floor. Would you like to sit down and talk for a moment?" Thomas looked surprised that I knew his name, but he nodded and followed me to a small waiting area near the nurse's station. He still held the bouquet of white roses, clutching them like a lifeline. "Mr. Bennett, I know about what happened to Elizabeth," I began carefully. "Dr. Morrison told me about the accident 25 years ago." Thomas closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "Then you know that I am a murderer. I killed my wife and our unborn child because I was too selfish and stupid to call a taxi." "Mr. Bennett, it was an accident," I said. "An accident that never should have happened," Thomas replied firmly. "I had 3 beers at my friend's house while watching a football game. Elizabeth called and asked me to pick her up from her school event. I should have said no. I should have told her to take a bus, but I thought I was fine to drive." Thomas opened his eyes, and I could see tears forming. "We were 2 blocks from our house when I ran the red light. I remember seeing the other car coming. I remember Elizabeth screaming, and then I remember waking up in the emergency room with minor cuts and bruises. And Elizabeth was in room 412. I said. Thomas nodded. For 3 weeks, I sat by her bed every single day, holding her hand, begging her to wake up, promising her that I would spend the rest of my life making up for what I had done." He paused and looked down at the white roses. "On the morning of October 15th, 1998, Elizabeth died. The doctors said there was too much internal damage. And our baby, a little girl we were going to name Sarah, died with her. I felt my heart breaking for this man who had carried his guilt and grief for 25 years. Mr. Bennett, why do you continue to come here every day?" I asked. "Because I made a promise to Elizabeth," Thomas replied. "After she died, I stood in room 412 and promised her that I would never forget what I had done. I promised that every single day for the rest of my life, I would come to this room and remember her." Thomas looked at me with an expression of desperate sincerity. "Nurse Rachel, do you know what the worst part of killing someone you love is? It is not the guilt, it is not even the prison time. It is knowing that every good thing that happens to you for the rest of your life is something they will never experience because of you. What happened after you got out of prison? I asked. I served 5 years for negligent homicide, Thomas said. Elizabeth's family wanted me to get more time, and they were right. When I got out of prison, I was 57 years old, alone and broken. He continued. I tried to rebuild my life. I got a job as a janitor at a community center. I lived in a small apartment. I went to EA meetings every week. But nothing I did could bring Elizabeth back or erase what I had done. Mr. Bennett, I said gently, I need to tell you something about room 412. I know the room is being used again. Thomas interrupted. I noticed a few weeks ago that there was a patient in there. But I still come every day and leave flowers outside the door. This surprised me. You knew the room was occupied? Yes, Thomas said. But my promise was to come to room 412 every day, not to visit an empty room. Whether the room is empty or occupied, this is where Elizabeth died. And this is where I come to remember her. I was struck by the dedication this man had shown for 25 years. Through rain, snow, holidays, and personal struggles, he had kept his promise to a woman he could never bring back. Mr. Bennett, have you told Elizabeth's family that you still come here? I asked. Thomas shook his head. Elizabeth's parents died years ago, still hating me. Her sister refuses to speak to me. They wanted me to disappear from their lives, so I did. So you have been doing this completely alone for 25 years? I asked. Yes, Thomas replied. No one knows I come here except the hospital security guards who have never stopped me. I thought about what Dr. Morrison had told me about Thomas being charged with negligent homicide. Mr. Bennett, do you still feel like you are serving a sentence for what happened? Thomas looked directly at me. Nurse Rachel, I will be serving this sentence for the rest of my life. The day I stop coming here is the day they bury me. As we sat in the waiting area, I noticed that Mrs. Henderson was being wheeled past us in a wheelchair by one of the orderlies. She was being taken for physical therapy. Mr. Bennett, I said, the patient in room 412 is named Mrs. Henderson. She is recovering from hip surgery. She has been receiving your flowers, even though you did not intend them for her. Thomas looked concerned. I hope I have not been causing any problems for her. Actually, I said, she has been enjoying the flowers, even though she did not know who they were from. But Mr. Bennett, I think there might be a way for you to honor Elizabeth's memory that could also help current patients. Thomas listened intently as I explained my idea. What if, instead of leaving flowers outside room 412, you brought flowers to different patients throughout the hospital who do not have visitors? You could still come every day, and you could still honor Elizabeth by spreading kindness to people who are suffering. Thomas was quiet for a long time, considering this suggestion. Finally, he looked at me and said, Nurse Rachel, Elizabeth was a teacher who spent her life helping others. Maybe you are right that the best way to honor her memory is to help people rather than just mourning at an empty spot. Over the next few weeks, Thomas Bennett began to transform his daily ritual. Instead of leaving flowers outside room 412, he started bringing bouquets to different patients throughout the hospital who had few or no visitors. I helped him by identifying patients who would benefit most from his kindness: elderly people without family, long-term patients who had been hospitalized for months, and people recovering from traumatic injuries who needed emotional support. Nurse Rachel, Thomas said one morning as he arrived with his usual white roses, I never realized how many people in this hospital are completely alone. It is one of the saddest parts of working here, I replied. Many patients spend weeks recovering without a single visitor. Thomas began spending more time at the hospital each day. Instead of just dropping off flowers and leaving, he started sitting with patients, talking to them, reading to them, and simply providing companionship to people who were lonely. Mrs. Chun, a 78-year-old woman recovering from a stroke, told me that Thomas' visits had become the highlight of her day. That kind man with the flowers talks to me about his wife Elizabeth. He tells me that she was a teacher who loved helping children. He says that visiting patients here helps him feel close to her memory. Mr. Davis, a 65-year-old man with terminal cancer and no family, said that Thomas was the only person who visited him. He brings me flowers every Thursday and sits with me for an hour, We talk about life, about regrets, about forgiveness. He does not judge me for dying alone. As I watched Thomas interact with patients, I realized that his daily ritual had evolved from an act of penance into an act of genuine compassion. He was no longer just remembering Elizabeth. He was honoring her by embodying the kindness and care she had shown to others during her life. One afternoon, Dr. Morrison pulled me aside with a concerned expression. "Rachel, I heard that Thomas Bennett has been visiting patients throughout the hospital. Do you think that is appropriate given his history?" "Dr. Morrison, I have been monitoring his visits closely," I replied. "Thomas has been nothing but respectful and helpful. Several patients have told me that his visits are therapeutic for them." Dr. Morrison nodded slowly. "I suppose 25 years of penance has earned him some redemption. But Rachel, we need to be careful. If Elizabeth's family found out that Thomas is here regularly, there could be problems." This was a valid concern. Elizabeth's sister, Margaret, still lived in Boston and had made it clear over the years that she wanted nothing to do with Thomas. 2 weeks later, my concerns about Elizabeth's family discovering Thomas became reality. Margaret Walker, Elizabeth's sister, came to the hospital to visit a friend who was recovering from surgery. As she walked through the hallway, she saw Thomas sitting with a patient, holding white roses. "What is he doing here?" Margaret demanded when she found me at the nurse's station. "That man killed my sister, and he is wandering around this hospital like he belongs here." I tried to calm her down. "Mrs. Walker, Mr. Bennett has been visiting patients who do not have family support. He has been very helpful and respectful. I do not care if he is Mother Teresa," Margaret said angrily. "He has no right to be in this hospital. Elizabeth died in this building because of him." I could see that Margaret was genuinely distressed, and I understood her feelings. "Mrs. Walker, would you be willing to speak with Mr. Bennett? Perhaps if you understood what he has been doing here, you might feel differently." "I have nothing to say to that man," Margaret replied. "I want him banned from this hospital." At that moment, Thomas walked around the corner, carrying an empty vase he was taking to refill with water. When he saw Margaret, he stopped completely, and the color drained from his face. "Margaret," Thomas said quietly, "I am sorry. I did not know you were here." Margaret stared at Thomas with an expression of pain and anger that had clearly not diminished in 25 years. "You killed my sister, Thomas. You killed Elizabeth and her baby, and you do not get to play the hero in the same hospital where she died." Thomas set down the vase and faced Margaret directly. "You are right. I have no right to be here. I will leave immediately and never come back." But before Thomas could walk away, something unexpected happened. Mrs. Chen, the stroke patient Thomas had been visiting, wheeled herself into the hallway using her walker. "Excuse me," Mrs. Chen said in her heavily accented English. "Are you the sister of Thomas' wife?" Margaret looked surprised. "Yes, Elizabeth was my sister. Who are you?" "I am patient here for 6 weeks," Mrs. Chen explained. "No family, no visitors, very lonely. But Thomas come every day, bring flowers, talk to me, read to me. He tell me about Elizabeth, how she was teacher, how she was kind. He say he visit patients to honor her memory." Margaret looked between Mrs. Chen and Thomas, clearly conflicted. Another patient, Mr. Davis, shuffled into the hallway with the fourth pole. "I would like to say something too. Thomas has been visiting me for 3 weeks. I am dying. I have no family, and I was completely alone until Thomas started coming. He does not try to cheer me up with lies. He sits with me and talks honestly about life, death, and forgiveness." Margaret looked overwhelmed by these testimonials. "But you do not understand what he did. He killed my sister because he was drunk." "We know," Mrs. Chen said. "Thomas tell us everything. He not hide his mistakes. He say he come here every day for 25 years because he promised his wife to never forget." Thomas had tears streaming down his face. "Margaret, I know that nothing I do will ever bring Elizabeth back or make up for what I took from you and your family. But these people have no one else. If I can provide some small comfort to them, maybe Elizabeth's death was not completely meaningless." Margaret stood silently for a long moment, looking at her sister's killer and the patients he had been helping. Finally, she spoke. "Thomas, I cannot forgive you. I do not know if I will ever be able to forgive you. But if helping these patients is how you honor Elizabeth's memory, then I will not stop you." Thomas nodded, understanding that this was the most he could hope for from Elizabeth's family. As Margaret prepared to leave, she turned back one more time. "Thomas, Elizabeth always said that people should be judged not by their worst mistake, but by what they do after. I think she would want you to continue helping these patients." October 15th marked the 25th anniversary of Elizabeth's death. I wondered how Thomas would handle this difficult milestone, and whether he would continue his new practice of visiting patients or return to his old ritual of leaving flowers outside room 412. When Thomas arrived at the hospital that morning, he was carrying not just one bouquet of white roses, but dozens of them. He had clearly spent a significant amount of money preparing for this day. "Mr. Bennett," I said, as he entered the hospital, "you have quite a lot of flowers today." "Today is the anniversary of Elizabeth's death," Thomas explained. "I wanted to bring flowers to every patient on this floor who does not have visitors. Elizabeth deserves a proper memorial." I helped Thomas distribute the flowers to patients throughout the floor. We visited Mrs. Chen, Mr. Davis, and at least 15 other patients who were alone in the hospital. Each person received a bouquet of white roses and a brief explanation that the flowers were in memory of Elizabeth Bennett, a teacher who had loved helping others. After we finished distributing the flowers, Thomas asked me a question I had not expected. "Nurse Rachel, would it be possible for me to visit room 412 one more time? I promise I will not disturb the current patient. Mrs. Henderson had been discharged 2 weeks earlier, and room 412 was currently empty while being prepared for the next patient." "Mr. Bennett, I think that would be appropriate," I said. I unlocked room 412 and allowed Thomas to enter. He stood in the middle of the room, looking around with an expression of deep sadness and memory. "This is where she died," Thomas said quietly. "I was sitting in that corner when the doctors told me there was nothing more they could do. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath." He paused, and I could see him struggling with emotions that were clearly still raw, even after 25 years. "Elizabeth never got to see our house finished. We had just bought it 3 months before the accident. She never got to teach another year of students. She never got to meet our daughter Sarah, who would have been 25 years old this year if I had not killed them both." Thomas walked to the window and looked out at the city. "Do you know what I think about every single day, Nurse Rachel? I think about all the children Elizabeth would have taught, all the lives she would have influenced, all the good she would have done if I had not taken that away from her." "Mr. Bennett," I said gently, "you cannot change the past, but you have spent 25 years trying to honor Elizabeth's memory. That has to count for something." Thomas turned back to face me. "Does it though? Does visiting sick people for 25 years balance out killing your wife and unborn child?" "I do not think the math works out in my favor." Before I could respond, Dr. Morrison entered the room. "Thomas, I hope you do not mind, but Nurse Rachel told me you would be here today. I wanted to speak with you." Thomas looked surprised. "Dr. Morrison, you were one of the doctors who treated Elizabeth. I remember you from the trial." Dr. Morrison nodded. "I was, and I testified about her injuries and cause of death." Cause of death testified about her injuries and cause of death. "Thomas, I want you to know something. In 25 years of medicine, I have seen many people cause harm to others through negligence or poor decisions. But I have never seen anyone take responsibility and do penance the way you have." Thomas looked uncomfortable with the praise. "Dr. Morrison, I am just trying to live with what I did." "No," Dr. Morrison said firmly. "You are doing much more than that. The patients you visit, the comfort you provide, the time and care you give, these are acts of genuine compassion, not just penance." Dr. Morrison continued. "Thomas, I think Elizabeth would be proud of the man you have become. Not proud of what you did, but proud of how you have tried to make amends." Thomas began to cry, and for the first time in 25 years, they were not just tears of grief and guilt, but also tears of something like healing. "Dr. Morrison, Nurse Rachel, I need to tell you both something," Thomas said. "I have been diagnosed with congestive heart failure. My doctors say I have maybe 2 or 3 years left. This news hit me hard. Thomas had become such a fixture at the hospital that I could not imagine him not being there. Mr. Bennett, I am so sorry, I said. Do not be sorry, Thomas replied. I have lived 25 years longer than Elizabeth did. But I want to ask you both for help with something important. What do you need? Dr. Morrison asked. When I die, I would like to be buried next to Elizabeth, Thomas said. Her family had me legally barred from visiting her grave, but I want to arrange to be buried in the same cemetery, as close to her as they will allow. He continued, and I would like to set up a fund in Elizabeth's name to provide flowers for hospital patients who do not have visitors. I have been saving money for years, and I wanted to continue the work I had been doing after I'm gone. Dr. Morrison and I were both moved by Thomas's request. He was not just trying to honor Elizabeth's memory during his life. He was trying to ensure that her legacy of kindness would continue after his death. Thomas, we will help you arrange that, Dr. Morrison said. As we prepared to leave room 412, Thomas took one last look around. 25 years ago, I destroyed everything I loved in this room. But maybe, just maybe, I've created something good here too. Thomas Bennett continued visiting patients at Memorial Hospital for 80 more months after that anniversary. During that time, he touched the lives of hundreds of patients who might otherwise have spent their hospital stays completely alone. When Thomas's heart condition worsened and he was admitted to the hospital as a patient himself, there was an outpouring of support from people throughout the hospital. Patients he had visited, nurses who had watched his transformation, and even some family members of patients who had passed away came to thank him for the kindness he had shown. The most surprising visitor was Margaret Walker, Elizabeth's sister. She came to see Thomas in his hospital room, carrying a photograph of Elizabeth. Thomas, Margaret said as she sat beside his bed, I brought you something. I thought you might want to see this picture of Elizabeth. It was taken the week before the accident. Thomas looked at the photograph with tears in his eyes. It showed Elizabeth smiling, her hand resting on her barely visible pregnant belly. Margaret, I do not deserve this kindness from you, Thomas said. You are right. You do not deserve it, Margaret replied honestly. But Elizabeth deserves to have someone remember her with love rather than just guilt. For 25 years, you have been punishing yourself. Maybe it is time to also remember the good parts. Margaret continued. Thomas, I have been talking to the patients you visited. Mrs. Chen told me that you sat with her every day for 3 months and helped her practice her English so she could communicate better with her doctors. Mr. Davis told me that you were the only person who made him feel like his life had meaning, even as he was dying. She paused and looked directly at Thomas. You killed my sister, and I will never forget that. But you also spent the last 25 years honoring her memory in the most meaningful way possible. Elizabeth was a teacher who believed in redemption and second chances. I think she would want me to tell you that you have earned some peace. Thomas died 2 weeks later, surrounded by hospital staff who had come to care deeply about him. In his final hours, he was not alone, which was fitting for a man who had dedicated the last quarter-century of his life to ensuring that others would not have to face suffering alone. We discovered that Thomas had arranged for his burial in the same cemetery as Elizabeth, in a plot that was as close to her grave as the cemetery would allow. His headstone had a simple inscription, Thomas Bennett, 1943 to 2024. He spent his life trying to make amends. Fund that Thomas established in Elizabeth's name continued to provide flowers for hospital patients without visitors. Every week, volunteers would distribute white roses to lonely patients, along with a card explaining that the flowers were in memory of Elizabeth Bennett, a teacher who had valued kindness and compassion. 6 months after Thomas's death, the hospital administration approved a small memorial plaque in the hallway near room 412. It read, in memory of Elizabeth Bennett, teacher and compassionate soul, and Thomas Bennett, who honored her memory through 25 years of service to others. May their story remind us that redemption is possible through dedication, compassion, and never-ending love. I often think about Thomas and his daily journey to room 412. What started as an act of grief and penance became an extraordinary example of how one person can transform tragedy into meaningful service to others. The strangest part of this story was not that Thomas brought flowers to an empty room for decades. The strangest part was that through his dedication to remembering Elizabeth, Thomas created a legacy of kindness that has continued to help lonely patients years after his death. Sometimes the most powerful acts of love are not the grand gestures we make when everything is going well, but the small, consistent acts of devotion we maintain even when we are carrying the weight of our deepest regrets. Thomas Bennett killed his wife and unborn child in a moment of terrible judgment. But he spent the rest of his life trying to honor her memory and help others, not because he thought it would earn him forgiveness, but because it was the right thing to do. Elizabeth's family eventually placed a small addition to her gravestone. Elizabeth Bennett, beloved sister, teacher, and wife. Her memory lives on through the kindness of others, and every day somewhere in Memorial Hospital a lonely patient receives a bouquet of white roses, a small reminder that they are not forgotten, that someone cares, and that even our worst mistakes can eventually give birth to something beautiful if we are willing to dedicate ourselves to making amends. Thomas never stopped loving Elizabeth, and he never stopped trying to make up for taking her life. That dedication, sustained over 25 years and continuing even after his death, is perhaps the truest expression of love I have ever witnessed.